500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die."
G'day, this is Expand the Phantom Podcast. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can subscribe to our podcast via YouTube or through your favourite podcast apps. Do not forget to give us a rating on your podcast app and tell a mate about us. I am Jermayn, and today I am joined by Dan. How are you, Dan?
Yeah, good afternoon, Jerm. Good afternoon, everybody. Living life large at the moment, Jerm, and enjoying things. So looking forward to today's podcast.
That is good. Yes, today's podcast, we are going to be learning about a grandfather of the Australian comic industry whose name is Peter Chapman. He has a large Australian comic and Frew history that we wanted to explore. Now, I don't know about you, Dan, but my knowledge is very limited. So we thought it would be best to get on board some more knowledgeable people than us. So g'day, Jeremy and Daniel. How are yous?
Oh, I'm very good. It's great to join you all here today. Fantastic.
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a lovely day here in downtown Adelaide.
Awesome. So, Jeremy, you have joined us before, and we first had this chat about exploring Peter and his history in the comics industry in Australia, but also Frew and the Phantom in episode 252. So thank you again for joining us. Daniel, this is your first time on the podcast.
Yeah, it is. I've listened to it a fair bit. I haven't listened to 252 of them, I have to say. I'm sorry. It's quite a number. Yeah, I have listened to quite a few, and I do recommend it to a number of people I know that are huge Phantom fans, and say, look, you should be listening to this and getting some information out of it. Whether they do or not, that's up to them, I suppose. But no, I've quite agree, and very, very, very thrilled to be here. It's a Phantom. I mean, far out. That's what we all grew up on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, while this may be the first time you've on the podcast, you actually have helped us in two cases. The first one was you helped us explore the history about the Phantom and Norm Breyfogle, which was a huge, I enjoyed learning about that, seeing these bits of artwork that no one had seen before. So thank you for that. And then the second time you actually helped us was when we were actually able to use two of those pieces for the bushfire fundraiser book that we put together.
Yeah, and that was a no-brainer for me, because Norm and myself were as close as siblings, really, when it come down to it. We developed a friendship first, and then sort of, we used to say we had like a little love affair between two heterosexual males that spanned the ocean. So when he passed, it was very troubling for me and very problematic, as it is when you lose a family member. So when you reached out with the bushfire thing, there was no hesitation, because it's the sort of thing that when people ask me these things regarding Norm, I think, what would he say? And on that one, he would have just went, yeah, what do you need? How much art do you want? What do you want me to draw? Do you want me to draw something new? Do you want to use something I've got? Do you want Batman? Being Phantom, he would have went, yes, definitely. Wouldn't have hesitated. So when you asked, it was, well, Norm would have said yes, so I'll say yes. And did exactly what Norm would have done, which is, here's all the artwork. You pick what you want, as much or as little as you want to use, and go for it. And it's great to see Norm still being published today, and we can still find fresh artwork to be published. And he would have been tickled pink to think that one of his Phantoms was being published in a Phantom publication in Australia, because he knew how much the Phantom meant to everyone here. We used to talk about it quite frequently, and certainly when he sent that artwork over, it was the best place for it, he used to say, because we're better for the Phantom to be living than Australia. So yeah, it's quite happy to help. And any time in the future, the art's still here. Norm would probably kick me metaphorically if I said no. I don't.
Well,
I
we've
don't need
got
a
that
flogging from a dead
recorded.
man. Yeah,
We've
well, I
got
don't
that
need a flogging from a
recorded
dead
now,
man.
so we'll hold you to that one.
Think
Hopefully,
so.
we won't have to do another
Mm.
fundraiser for a little while, and hopefully, there won't be anything else like the bushfire books or anything like that. That was quite devastating. But we are talking about Peter Chapman, so so we'll change tack a little bit now. This is the first time you've joined us, so we'll let our guest go first, Jeremy. Sorry, but your family. So we always let our guests go first. So Daniel, could you just tell us a little bit about your history with Peter Chapman, your interactions with him, and stuff like that? And then what we'll do, we'll let Jeremy go, and then we're going to go into a little bit of a bio about Peter, and then we're going to go from there and have some interesting topics.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I never met Peter, which, there's a lot of people I really wish I'd met or at least spoken to once in my life and never had the opportunity to for whatever reason. So my interactions with him have always been a distance. I grew up a fan, obviously, because in growing up in the 70s, the comic books were all over the place. You couldn't sneeze for having, something like the Shadow or the Phantom Ranger or the Phantom or whatever just fall out of the woodwork. Those old newsprint Frews and everything else. My uncle used to bring them over when he was a truck driver, and he'd bring them and grey down comics and just drop them off for us to read. And people up the street, I don't want these anymore. Do you want them? So I grew up with the artwork without knowing who I was looking at. It was quite different to the American stuff where you knew who you were looking at because they had all the credits there. The Australian stuff, you had no idea. And you just think, God, that's really good, or that's not really good. You'd see some stuff, for example, like Moira Bertram, and you'd just go, my God, that's just too good for a comic book. And Peter Chapman's artwork was always there, alongside with a number of other people. And it was always front and center of the mind because of the sheer output that he did. All of those old newsprint comics, you could pick them up for like 2, 3 cents, 5 cents each at secondhand shops. So it was great for a young lad buying comic books. You just go, I've got 50 cents, 10 comic books. Yay, I'm out of here. Full. And before I know it, I'm reading all this artwork. So fast forward, I decided in about 2015 that I wasn't going to write about comic books anymore or the artists or anything, because I wanted to go into writing about film and cinema. And of course, once Gary Challoner found out that I'd pretty much given up the game, he contacted me and said, look, this year's Ledger, we need an article about Peter Chapman. So when can you have it done by? Oh, great. I thought I'd given it up and hadn't. So I started delving into his life and doing the research. I thought, this guy's amazing. Fascinated by it. And then as I'm going along, and I'm sure everyone's had this moment where you're looking at things and go, that was him. Oh, I remember that. That was great. No wonder I liked it, because all of these things were this one person. So it just snowballed from there. And I thought, I do really like his artwork, and I do like what he did. So it just sort of came about from there. But again, I had an opportunity to make a phone call, and like an idiot, never did. Should have, could have, would have, didn't. That's on me. But it's just the growing up with him. The Shadow. I mean, I love the Shadow. I always thought that was such an interesting character. A guy with just 2 eye slits and nothing. Far better from the Shadow that I'd previously known growing up, which of course was Orson Welles' voice. What evil lurks in the heart of men. And reading this comic book, thinking that's not the Orson Welles Shadow. What's going on here? So yeah, it was just around about that, doing that. So it was. I blame Gaz for reigniting a love of the Australian comic book stuff, the comic book scene from way back when, and it's just sort of gone from there. I was so pleased to be able to write the Peter Chapman bio for the Ledger Awards that year. I didn't get a chance to go to the Ledgers because Gaz wanted me to go and actually do the presentation, but we weren't able to get over there for it. We went over the following year. But yeah, that's where my involvement with Peter Chapman and his artwork and his storytelling comes from.
Awesome. Now, this article with the Ledgers, is that available on the Ledgers website to read, or is it only in in a magazine or something for those who are interested in?
It came out in the 2016 annual.
Jeremy, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your history with Peter, please?
Sure. Well, just going on from what Daniel just said, if you look in the Narrabri newspapers at the time, I think some are online, you can actually see photos of Peter with his Ledger Award holding it up. He was very pleased about that at the time. But I'd say just in terms of how I came about Peter's work, it was mostly through the book Panel by Panel. So that's this book here. If anyone hasn't seen it, you should really seek it out. And this particular copy is actually signed by Peter. So it's signed by a number of the artists, Peter Chapman, Monty Wedd, Paul Wheelerhan, Stanley Pitt, a few of them at the time. So that's pretty amazing. But that's probably where I first discovered them. And what happened was I saw a picture of Peter Chapman in Inkspot magazine. And what had happened was he'd come to Sydney for ACE, the Australian comic book exhibition, which was touring around about 95, 96. And a lot of the old artists who were still alive at the time had come for that. And there was particularly in the Rocks at Sydney, but there are a few photos that John Clements had taken, and they appeared in Inkspot. And then I saw a photo of Peter in the Narrabri Courier, because I lived near Tamworth and Narrabri in the 90s, and that's where I found about his art classes. So he used to run art classes around Narrabri, and at that time, he some of the things I was interested in, he showed me how to do, was particularly some of the ways he did comic book layouts. I got to go to his studio, see a lot of his work. So his paintings were particularly amazing. He'd really progressed at that time. And so particularly with comics, because that was something I was interested in at the time. And he actually, I brought over some comic pages I'd been working on, and he actually helped me improve the layouts a lot. There's one particular story, Daniel might have actually heard of it. It was a comic that was published at the time called Knee Pockets. So there's one particular story that Peter helped with the layouts on, improved them a lot. So he did different overlays and things, just showing how to make it better. So I think Peter, he had a philosophy that was just to produce art and keep doing it, and you would improve. So that was something he always taught in his classes.
So just to jump in, sorry, Jeremy, just for international listeners and perhaps even Australian listeners, you're saying the word Narrabri. So that's a town that is about 6 hours drive northwest of Sydney, about 6.5 hours drive southwest of Brisbane. So really is kind of in the middle of nowhere in New South Wales country. That's pretty remarkable that someone of Peter's import was living out in Narrabri. Do you know the story of how he came to be there, or?
Yes. So what had happened, he was born in Sydney in 1925, and he lived in Sydney all his life. But I believe it was his brother-in-law who had a property out near Narrabri. I think it was Bar, and so he moved out there. And Daniel, I think you've seen letters that may come from there to John Ryan, but he moved out there, and his family actually had a history of art. So his uncle was Percy Leeson, the political cartoonist and commercial artist, who was quite famous in Australia and America. I think Peter said he never actually met him, but I know he was certainly inspired by that. And yeah, I think he moved out to country New South Wales about 1970-ish, sort of around that early period. And he would sometimes come back into Sydney, though, to deliver artwork. So as you say, quite a long drive. That's 5 or 6 hours that he'd sometimes come in to deliver, particularly at that time, like cover paintings and things like that, Horwitz Publications.
And these are actually the proper towns' names. I know I'm sure we've got plenty of people from like Sweden and America and all that thinking, Matt, these guys are just making up towns, but these are actually their names. So yeah, no, wow, that's interesting. So Dan, can you please share the bio and where it came from and stuff?
So this the bios come from this book, From Sunbeams to Sunset, which is a pretty extraordinary album put together by Graham Cliff, who's obviously pretty keen historian of Australian comic books, and the subtitle is The Rise and the Fall of the Australian Comic Book from 1924 to 1965. So as Jeremy said, Peter, born in 1925, sort of at the start of the I guess the era that Australian comic books were really going great guns, and certainly Graham would say that Australian created comic books went through a bit of a death, if you like, in the mid-1960s, and I guess there's opportunities to talk about that as well. But anyway, so the biography of Peter is comes from this book, and actually clearly Graham has a great deal of time for Peter Chapman, because this book is actually dedicated to the memory of Peter Chapman in particular. 1925, died in 2016, so clearly not long after he was awarded with that Ledger award. So anyway, as I say, I'll just get in and read the bio. Peter Chapman was born in the Sydney suburb of Camararay in 1925. As a youngster, he suffered the crippling disease of poliomyelitis, which limited the choice of careers that were open to him. Between 1940 and 1943, he studied art full-time at East Sydney Technical College. Peter began freelancing, and by 1946, so as a 21-year-old, he was securing regular assignments from Frank Johnson. His comic strips appeared in almost 20 of Johnson's one-shot titles, and in the latter half of that decade of the 40s, he wrote and drew strips for Johnson's continuing titles like Gem, New Adventure, and True Pirate. By the early 1950s, Chapman's strip artwork had appeared across a range of publishers, which included Ayres and James, Lilliput Productions, Illustrated Publications, and Associated General Publications. I guess the number of these companies gives you some idea as to the size of the Australian comic book industry at that time. He was also one of the artists hired to draw Rusty and Dusty, which was an advertising strip promoting Vaseline hair tonic. Eventually, most of Peter's very substantial strip output was for Frew Publications, which I guess is of keen interest to us. Through the 1950s, in particular, Peter drew covers and created original titles for Frew, which included Angel Brigade, The Green Skeleton, and Sir Falcon. And some of these are certainly featured in the giant size that are coming out now, and you hear about those there. He also took over and became the premier artist for Frew's The Shadow, which Daniel's already mentioned, and The Phantom Ranger. For KG Murray's Pocket Man magazine, he drew 12 adventures of the crime-fighting reporter, Jimmy Smart. The early 1960s saw Chapman work with colour in books published by Australian Visual Education Proprietary Limited and Readabout Publishers, and contributing to Coca-Cola Australia's promotional booklets. In 1965, he took up a job in illustration and design with John Sands. That piqued my interest because John Sands did the Phantom greeting cards through the 1980s. I didn't know if Peter had any influence there. Jeremy might be able to fill us in, I don't know. In the meantime, in the 1970s, Chapman shifted to country New South Wales, which we've just said. Between 1970 and 1992, he freelanced to Horwitz Publications, drawing covers for the publisher's paperback Western novels. Peter also became increasingly involved in art training, which is how Jeremy got to know him. He founded his own art school in 1989, and in 1993 created his own travelling art show. Peter Chapman continued to teach art until 2009. Aside from the Frank Johnson one-shots, his strips appeared in 22 continuing titles. Partly owing to the frequent reprinting of his work, Peter was the most prolific Australian comic book artist of the era. Summing up Peter Chapman's appearances in locally created comic books, his strips appeared in more than 400 comics. Peter Chapman died in 2016, as we said. So a massively influential person when it comes to Australian comic strips, comic art, and we're very lucky to have had him spend so much time working for Frew and being involved in the fandom as a result.
If I recall correctly, I think he said obviously a lot of that early work was with Frank Johnson. I think he said his very, very first work might have been for KG Murray. Some of the Man, that was how he remembered it anyway.
Sure.
A lot of people from that era, their first work was KG Murray. So KG Murray at that point in the mid 40s, early 40s, mid 40s through to the late 40s, were just snapping up everyone, no matter where they started. And they were hugely prolific pulling out stuff, not just the comic books, but as Jeremy mentioned, magazines such as Man and Adam, Man Junior, whether it be a strip in there or little illustrations. So he would no doubt be correct in assuming that his early work would have appeared in there, because it probably did. One thing that always impressed me with him was that he was able to produce an entire comic book at his peak. That's writing, drawing, so penciling, inking, lettering, the whole lot in a week, and that would be 32 pages. He could pump out 6 pages a day, fully finished. That's why he was so prolific, because he was so fast and so good. He could sit there and just, we need a comic book, Peter. Done. Here it is. So he was very good, very quick. So that's why Jeremy's so quick as well. Ask Jeremy to draw something, he'll do it in 10 minutes.
So I know what was also interesting is because Peter was one of the people that had such a good memory and had worked at that early stage with Frank Johnson. A lot of the history we have now, he was able to identify a lot of artists, and a lot of the work that he did at that time, a fair bit of it has survived. So one thing I remember was when they had the Pulp Confidential exhibition in Sydney in about 2015, Peter actually came down, Peter and his wife, and they had a behind the scenes tour with their family, and they actually invited me to come along as well, which was quite amazing because they brought out a lot of the old artwork that had survived, and Peter sort of just went through and made comments on different things. There were full art stories that they had, and he was going through all sorts of things. He remembered all sorts of information. So Professor Peter Doyle from Macquarie University has recorded a lot of information. He recorded some interviews, but a lot of the information about Frank Johnson was due to that kind of information. What had happened with the Frank Johnson original artwork was the publisher had kept all of the artwork and things in the shed, and the State Library of New South Wales had been interested in the more literary side. So they purchased a lot of it, and then they found out that it was comics and pulps. So they just kind of dumped it in their collection, and a lot of it wasn't fully catalogued until many years later. So a lot of Peter's early artwork actually did survive, which was unusual because a lot of publishers would burn all of their material. Unfortunately, we'll probably get to it later, but a lot of the Frew material didn't survive.
With the Frew material, Jeremy, I mean, you spoke with Peter a fair bit. Was he able to identify the phantom pages that he drew?
Yes, well, he was. So
a lot of ghost work.
Yes. So what would happen with the phantoms? Generally, he would perhaps do a cover if Tommy Hughes was away on holiday or unavailable. So I sent Jermayn and Dan a few examples of ones that he had said, these are ones that I had done. Issue number 101 was a particular one. He said, I did that one. And issue 150 was another one that he had said, I did that one. And some of the other ones that he would do would be the giant size. So some of the, particularly the wackier ones, like the Phantom and Shadow and Phantom Ranger all on a surfboard or going down like on a water slide. That would often be Peter Chapman. So that's kind of the grandfather of the wonderful Glenn Lumsden covers today.
Yes.
Sort of the weird, yes.
Yeah.
There's an example. They're all just
If you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see some of these as we kind of flick through them. So this is a giant size. This is giant size number 5. So did he do all the giant size covers? Or
no,
No.
he did. He probably did about the first 7, and then I think
Okay.
John Dixon did a few, and then after that, it would have been. He did some of them, like a few of them are by another artist who we're not entirely sure who did it. But he definitely did at least the first 7 and then a few sort of assorted ones after that. And one way you can tell is often if you see the characters here appearing in a similar style to his other work, you can tell. So you can see there that that's his Phantom Ranger, Shadow, and Sir Falcon. So that's one way of identifying it. But Peter did use a lot of different styles. So his Phantom does not always look exactly the same.
So the other one you mentioned was Frew 101.
Yes.
Which
So
is
that
this...
one, yeah, that one there, if you look at it, you can actually see that on the fisherman there, even the ink lines do quite look a fair bit like some of the shadow covers. But that's one there in particular that Peter said that he did. And I think, as you mentioned before, Jermayn, I think Phantom-wise, I think Ray Moore was an influence for sure. And even some of the other like giant size covers, you can see a Ray Moore influence, I think, on the way that he would do it.
He also ghosted some of the inside pages and some of the
Yes.
panels, which
Yes,
a lot of people knew. Yeah.
So with some of those ones, I think what would happen is sometimes that they would receive bromides and they were sort of pasted up. And from the early 50s, essentially, Peter would often do a lot of those. The reason he might do them is maybe they'd arrived damaged, they'd be missing. But one of the reasons that people don't really talk about as much is sometimes they were sent in the wrong size. So sometimes they wouldn't. Yes, and here's some examples here that Kevin Patrick has identified as being drawn by an artist. We're not entirely sure who may have done those ones.
So this is Frew issue 355.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is one of the pages here.
Yeah.
So you can definitely see, and then there. So in your opinion, Jeremy, would this be Peter Chapman?
I know some ones that Peter definitely did. I'm not entirely sure about these ones. There were a few artists who aren't really known who did do some of this editing work as well. I know that some of the editing work was done by Tommy Hughes, and some of the other editing work was done by the staff artists at Australian Consolidated Press. So I think one of the things to think about with the history of Frew is that a lot of it was tied to the publishing world and newspaper world at the time. That's where Tommy Hughes came in to do a lot of the early Frew covers, a lot of the art editing. He worked in Australian Consolidated Press, and that's where Ron Forsyth also worked. So Ron Forsyth was with the Daily Telegraph, I believe. I think Tommy Hughes was mostly with the Australian Women's Weekly. But a lot of the early artists and a lot of the early people involved were sort of involved in that area, particularly sort of around that Castlereagh Street, Pitt Street area in Sydney.
Yeah, right, and that's obviously where Frew had its offices for, and Ron Forsyth. Most Phantom fans would know that he's the F in Frew from that group of 4 men that brought it together in the first instance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're saying that Frew wasn't their full-time job? It was what, more of a hobby, or?
Well, I know particularly with Tommy Hughes, that was like it sort of a hobby, sort of like a second job, sort of additional money. So with Tommy Hughes, a lot of the covers he would draw some of them he would kind of outsource to other people who may work in the art department. So that's probably why you'll see that they can look very, very different. some of those covers. So some of the early ones in particular, Tommy Hughes did draw, but some of the other ones were drawn by other staff members who would assist. So a lot of Terry Wellesby, he originally started at Australian Consolidated Press. So a lot of the early Frew did come from that connection.
He did.
Yeah.
I know that. So you said Terry Wellesby. That's Tessa, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So he, I think what happened was apparently with Tommy Hughes, eventually, when he decided to stop doing the covers, he sent Terry as his replacement, basically. But Terry had already done covers. I think Terry was a little bit more agreeable to taking direction from Jim Shepard. So that was one reason. But yeah, that there was that connection all the way through to at least the 80s, from the 1940s to the 80s. And getting back to Peter Chapman, he did say that he sort of came around about the sort of the 1949-ish. And his connection as well did come through that Daily Telegraph, Daily Mirror, Consolidated Press connection as well. So if you're interested, the direct way that he got in was with the Phantom Ranger. So with the Phantom Ranger, there was a French writer called Eddie Brooker, and Eddie Brooker wasn't his real name, but his real name was something like Edward Osterman. People aren't entirely sure, but he was known as a pulp writer in France. And I think he did a series, and it was sort of a rough translation is the Master of the Invisible. So it was kind of a, you can find a lot of the covers online. So they're mostly credited to Eddie Brooker. And Eddie Brooker, he wrote a series for Ayres and James, which was mentioned before, called The Invisible Avenger, which was drawn by Virgil Riley. And Peter Chapman took over drawing that at some point. And Eddie Brooker was an early writer for Frew on The Phantom Ranger with Jeff Wilkinson. So that's how Peter Chapman became involved with Frew, with his connection with Eddie Brooker. And yeah.
Sorry, just to jump in the Sunbeams book, Graham Cliff has said that acknowledged Edward Osterman, who you said, although he said that those were uncredited. So I guess that is a bit of guesswork there. He said, and Graham says that Peter Chapman took over the Phantom Ranger effective as of issue number 20, and then went on to create the full series right through till 1959.
That's right. So the Phantom Ranger, I've actually got the Phantom Ranger here. So this is the Phantom Ranger #1.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so that was the first original creation. So the first original series done by Frew. And as you say, Dan, it was about issue number 20 that Peter took over there. And what had happened was with Ron, who he became quite good friends with, Ron thought that he could do a better job writing it than Eddie Brooker, because I'm not sure if it's mentioned in Sunbeams to Sunset, but Eddie Brooker, being French, had to have a lot of his scripts translated. And so he would often write them in French or partly in French, and they'd be translated. And they were quite wordy. And Ron Forsyth thought that Peter Chapman could do the whole job better and quicker. So that's really how Peter got into Frew. And that was sort of in those early days. And I know that he actually mentioned that it was only quite lucky that Frew actually published The Phantom at all. Apparently that was just one of the ones they were offered. They just wanted to publish a comic, being the time that it was a profitable thing to do. The Phantom was one of the ones they were offered. I think the other thing was potentially like a humor comic.
Oh,
But
wow.
they knew the Phantom from the Women's Mirror, so they chose the Phantom, which is lucky for all of us.
Yeah.
The Phantom Ranger really was very popular at the time. I'm sure Daniel can add a bit here as well, but there was a radio show with Bud Tingwell from the Castle. There was merch.
Yep.
I've actually got some merch here. It's scarf. So that was some of the merch they used to have at David Jones. So you've probably seen some of the ads for like cowboy hats and all those things there. So the Phantom Ranger was huge, wasn't it, Daniel?
It was incredibly popular. It was right up there with the Lone Avenger. In fact, it took over from the Lone Avenger for obvious reasons, which we won't get into on a PG broadcast. But yeah, because kids in that era loved westerns, and the Phantom Ranger appealed to them. They loved adventure. They loved the serials, all of that kind of stuff. So they first gravitated towards the Lone Avenger and then went to the Phantom Ranger. I suppose primarily because he was more, I suppose you'd have to look at it in the sense that as a child, you couldn't be Sir Falcon. And the Shadow was a bit too esoteric for a child to aim towards, but you could be the Phantom Ranger quite easily.
Did the Phantom Ranger go on to be published in Brazil? Wasn't that one of the publications that Frew actually
Yes,
wrote?
that's right, RGE, and it was I think the Shadow and Sir Falcon, and I think also the Phantom Ranger was published in the UK with those lovely painted covers.
Yeah, wow.
That's another thing about Peter Chapman is he's been published around the world and quite early on. And I know he actually told me once on the phone that he wasn't paid for any of the reprints, but who was really at that time, sadly.
He did make a fair bit of money though, because at one point he was being paid. I found out that he was actually being paid £110 per week for his comic book artwork, and that was at a point where the average wage was just over £20. So I won't say he was making out like a bandit, but he was doing quite well. Literally, he could have bought a house with 10 weeks worth of wage and set himself up quite comfortably. So he could have made, as we all know with the creators from that era, they could have made more, should have made more, but considering what some of them were paid, peanuts for working hard, he worked hard and was paid quite a good sum of money for working hard and working fast. So having said that, could have trebled it, would have made him happier.
Jeremy, for the uneducated fan out there, what are some telltale style signs Phantom fans or fans of Frew or whatever should look for if they want to have a look at a Frew cover? And is there something to look for in his faces, in his hands, or I think you made mention of his inking styles? Is that like a heavy ink, or like are there any like telltale signs that that people can look out for?
I think probably the best thing would be to look at those early giant size, probably the first 7, and that's a very good indicator of his style on the Phantom. He also, I think, probably he would have a thicker line than Tommy Hughes. So he'd often have that thick brush line particularly on the clothes and the folds. So that's something you can notice. And I think even the faces would sort of look more like a sort of a Ray Moore type thing.
Okay, so thick on the clothes. Interesting.
Well, if you go back to that first Phantom cover you showed, I think it was 101, was it? Way back when. You can see that really thick use of ink all over the clothes. Some of them, it's almost going black. Around his belt, around the arm there. So it's a good indicator. I mean, his Phantom was I won't say generic Phantom, but it was a house style Phantom because that's what they were told to do. But going on from what Jeremy was saying, if you don't look at his Phantom and look at the other characters, you can spot him quite easily. When he's doing the other strips like the Shadow and the other books that he did, it's quite apparent it's him with his Phantom. Yeah, and then you look at the background and you look at the inks there that he's using there. I mean, the use of black here on the arms and the shading on the back, the feathering and all of that. You know, again, his Phantom is one thing, his background characters are another. Uh, Jeremy, did you slip them a copy of the Green Skeleton?
Oh well, there's the
There we
green
go.
skeleton
Yeah,
there.
and
So
that's a great. That's like the classic Peter Chapman one. Do you guys know the story behind the Green Skeleton?
Oh, but we would love to hear it.
Love to hear it, yeah.
So what happened was in the late 40s and early 50s, all of the women's groups and the church groups and that were trying to ban comic books because they were horrific, scary. And Peter Chapman had a comic book out called The Vampire. So it was coming out for Christmas, and they were sticking them in stockings. So you'd buy your stocking, the ones we used to get as kids, and they'd have lollies in them and stuff like that. So they'd all have this comic book in there called Vampire. And parents groups were up in arms because you're sticking this horror comic in children's stockings. Well, it wasn't a horror comic. Vampire was a woman detective. So because they were trying to ban that, his next comic book was The Green Skeleton, which of course, you look at the cover, that's one of the most horrific covers that came out of the 1950s. So it was almost, I would love to have asked him, did you do that deliberately? Just because, you wanted to ban something that wasn't a horror comic. Here's a horror comic for you. Ban that, because that is truly a scary comic. I remember seeing that as a kid and it gave me nightmares. Dancing skeletons is not something you expect to see on a kid's comic book. So that's how that one came about. It was an answer to banning something that wasn't horror, claiming that it was. Well, here's the horror comic.
I know the Green Skeleton is one that Glenn Ford is particularly keen to get into the giant size. You see in the message from the publisher for just about every one of the new era giant size books calls for, anyone who's got a copy of this, that, or the other. And the Green Skeleton is always in the list of wanted books from Glenn, so that he could, do some scans and hopefully share it with all of us. So if you've got a copy, hit up Glenn Ford. He'd love it. He'd love to see.
I think he found someone that may have all of them, but I think they're in storage at the moment. So I believe it will happen.
Oh, that's awesome.
Everything's always in storage.
So just back on the vampire that Daniel mentioned, that was actually reprinted in one of the giant size if anyone wants to check it out. So you'll see it's actually not.
It's not a horror.
It's not horror. I think it just happened to be put in like show bags or Christmas stockings.
Christmas stockings, it was.
Yeah, and that was what caused the big kerfuffle. But as you can see for yourself, it's all quite tame, really.
I'm pretty sure I'm correct in this one. I'll stand to be corrected otherwise. In Perth, they took a whole pile of them out and burnt them out the front of like a David Jones or whatever it was. We're going to burn all of these horrible comics and these horror comics, and people were saying it's not a horror comic. It's like Brenda Starr. It's a detective, but no, it's the vampire. It must be horrible. And to be fair, I mean that was at a point where Australia had instituted a ban on horror films. So anything cinema-wise that had vampire in it was never coming in, which prevented a few films coming in which had vampire or vamp in the titles, which weren't horror films, because in the traditional sense, a vampire was a woman who would go around and vamp.
Right.
Strike a pose. Madonna. Madonna's a vampire, a vamp.
Well, I'll tell you what,
that's where it all came about.
That's worth the YouTube subscription right there, just to watch Daniel doing some vamp moves. It must have been a really difficult time to be a creator in Australia when there's such a conservative force moving through to parent groups and community groups, church groups like you're talking about. Jeremy, did Peter ever talk about the restrictions or the difficulties of trying to get stuff published without being censored, or was it what Jermayn sort of suggested, or Daniel sort of suggested there as a bit of a, well, I'll stick it up at and try and double down?
I think they were, they regarded it as a bit silly. Like there'd be publications where there'd be long lists of comic books and which ones were good and which ones were bad, and which ones were bad for your children. I think, I think he found it kind of ridiculous about the vampire. I think he, it annoyed him a little bit, but I think really he would just do his whatever he wanted really with a lot of the comics. It was just producing them because, as you say, he produced so much. I think he would just be on to the next book, really.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, I think it was estimated that he had 400 comic books put out in a 12-year period.
Yeah, I think considering all the reprints, there would have been over 400, and if you consider all the ones overseas, like really, he was very, 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 published in a lot of books. And I think the other thing to consider is with the Frew editions he did, particularly the Shadow, Phantom Ranger, and even Sir Falcon, they were reprinted quite a few times. So he did a certain number of original issues, but after that, it was they were reprinted, first by Frew and then by Page Publications for the showbag market. So the Phantom Ranger reached nearly 200 issues, I believe. I think it actually, I think the Phantom Ranger got up to about issue number 209, if you count those sort of last few showbag editions. Often they'd have the same covers. And the Shadow reached about 168. So with the Shadow, there was the 2 series as well. With the Shadow, there was this first one. So this is the first issue of the Shadow. There was 23 issues there. And of that, Peter did issue number 13 to number 23. And then the second series, some of which have been published in giant size. He did issue number 1 till issue number 63. But those were reprinted until about issue 168. So, over 105 issues just of reprints.
Wow.
And those issues back in the when you talk about the women, the church groups, I think saying the women's groups, because a lot of them were. Now, I'm not being sexist or anything. It's just how it was back then. The church groups were worse. But the groups that were concerned about censorship and they were concerned about comic books, it didn't stop them from selling, tens to hundreds of thousands of each issue. Like these comic books were huge, and it didn't stop cinemas giving them away. Like you'd have a matinee of the latest John Wayne serial or whatever. It was, hey kids, come along, get a free comic book. And they'd pay their 5 cents, 10 cents, or whatever, a couple of pence or whatever it was back then, and get their free comic book and go in and see the movie. So these comic books, although there was groups up in arms, and some comic books were being banned. My favorite was the romance comics that were banned for various reasons. But these comic books were being banned, but it never prevented them from selling in numbers which, if you could get those numbers now, any creator would be so happy to have these numbers. They were literally flying off the shelves. It was great. So it just goes to show, the more you try to censor, the more the kids will buy it.
So so maybe we need a bit more censoring then. We've talked a little bit about some interactions with Ron Forsyth. Is there any others, like with Jim Shepard or anything else from like a Frew perspective? Any stories with the fandom or anything else like that you can remember?
Just a few more interesting things. I think speaking of the romance comics, Peter did a lot of editing and paste up, particularly of the romance comics. So similar thing to the Phantom, where he would take the bromides and edit them, cut them up, particularly like in digest size, do a lot of painted covers, repaint covers from overseas. I think just some of the things in particular about the early Frew days that people might be interested in. They had a very small staff, which even back then they had. Tommy Hughes with the covers. Even then, he would often send someone around just to deliver the work. He'd never go to the office himself. So often he'd either outsource the drawing or even outsource the delivery to another person there. I think with the Frew staff, as you probably may know, it was really Ron Forsyth and Peter Richardson. I think they were the F and the R, they were the two that actually had a direct involvement, and Ron was probably one of the main people. They had, the very small staff. Ron was there most of the time. They'd had sort of a lady receptionist, and she actually apparently wrote some stories as well for Frew. So I've heard that she may have been involved in different things. I don't know precisely what she wrote, but that's quite interesting that she was involved in that area there. Just trying to think of some interesting things.
I have
I
heard
think,
that story about
yeah,
the receptionist from Kevin when we were doing
yes,
so when we did an article on female phantom riders, Kevin did make mention of that little tidbit.
yes. Oh, Kevin, that article that Kevin did, which is on Chronicle Chamber, is another excellent article. The one that is still on the Chronicle Chamber to this day. The one I think called The Phantom Artist, and it's got about Peter Chapman. I think he mentions in there the story with Ron Forsyth, how they went to see the psychoanalyst, I think, and they actually went and they were trying to distill what made the Phantom popular, and then put all of that into the Phantom Ranger. So
Right.
that's, Peter would always say, yes, the Phantom was a massive influence on Sir Falcon. And, he said it was, and deliberately so. They wanted to sell lots of comics. So he did with Sir Falcon, he did the first about 20 issues of that, I think. And then John Dixon and Kick took over as there was that excellent history of Kick in the Neville Bain book that you might have seen that was reprinted recently by Frew. So yeah, I think particularly when Peter moved up to the Blue Mountains, he would often sort of come down once every couple of weeks. And to finish that work, to meet his deadlines, he would work very hard. So he would, sometimes he would just work all night to meet that deadline. And, when he was in the office, often they'd get him to do edits to the Phantom book or other books, make corrections, make changes. And as you said, he would do the entire book. So that's, he would do it from writing it, he would do it from drawing it all, lettering, even the color overlays. He would do the entire package. And I know he told me, because I was very interested in how he wrote them. And he said it was page to page. He'd just try and make it sort of end at an exciting point per page.
So did he write like a script, like in a sense, get a bit of paper and go box 1, scene 1, or did he literally just start drawing and?
Well, he would start drawing, and to make it even quicker, Ron Forsyth actually had some of the layouts pre-printed, the boxes, just to even speed it up just that little bit.
Yeah, well.
So that's why some of them, they would have the panels. That's why they have that very consistent look, because they were pre-printed just to speed it up just that little bit.
So you didn't have to spend 5 minutes ruling it up. You can. Yeah, wow. So would he still pencil and then ink, or would he just go straight to ink?
I believe sometimes he would go quite closely just to ink. Like he might do some rough penciling, but sometimes he would go very close to straight to ink, which Paul Wheelerhan, I know, did a similar thing sometimes. Especially when they were running close to deadline, they'd do a lot of it close to just inks. Keith Chatto only did quite rough pencils. So he was another artist who would often, be doing things very quickly, meeting those deadlines. Yeah.
I think
Now,
Keith Chatto, and you can correct me on this, Germ, probably. Keith Chatto had the first Australian published Phantom story published by Frew. Was that him in the 90s?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Should have been Gary Challoner.
Yes, I have heard that story.
Yeah.
You might as well share that, Daniel, while you make mention of it.
That's right. Throw me under a bus. What am I saying? I threw myself. Because Gary had a studio which was the floor above Frew in Sydney. And he used to obviously run into Jim Shepard all the time. So Jim mentioned how he was going to be doing an Australian story, and would Gary like to draw it? Gary went, sure, no problems, love to, great. So it was all lined up. And then Keith came up to see Gary to sell a strip to him. And he wanted a bit too much money, and Gary said, no, I'll pass on it. So he went down to, Keith went downstairs, popped in to see Frew. And then the next time Gaz ran into Jim Shepard, he said, oh, by the way, you're not doing the Phantom story anymore because Keith's doing it. Apparently he undercut him.
Oh, wow.
I mean, but Gaz never held a grudge. He's one of these people that just went, oh, well, so be it. So it was going to be Shalloner, but it ended up being Chatto.
Oh, there you go.
No, I mean, it's still a good story. Still a great story. But yeah, that's how that one came about. Could have been Gaz. He could have been a contender.
Sliding doors moment. So,
Yeah.
Jeremy, what happened to, and I know there's a lot of original art collectors of the Phantom that listen to this, but also probably others that would be interested as well. What happened to all the original artwork?
Yes, well, I know that Peter said that he had he wanted to follow up with Ron Forsyth and find out. And my understanding was that he asked Ron Forsyth, and it was just about all gone. And so I think most of it was either thrown out or burnt. I have heard some interesting stories that, like, apparently a lot of the file copies, bound editions, would sometimes just be randomly sold by Frew in sort of times when they was a bit of upheaval or whatever. I did speak to someone recently who compiled a Frew fanzine, and he had access to a lot of their file copies, which they'd sold to someone at the time. And so that's how he had information on a lot of those sort of more obscure one shots, like the Green Skeleton scoop and some of those other ones. So I know that in the 90s, particularly around that Ace time, some fans contacted Peter, and they were interested in artwork. And because there was none, sadly, he actually drew some commissions for people. So there's an example of a commission he drew for Jim Shepard, and that one had the Phantom in it. And you've probably seen that one on the back of Giant Size #1, all nicely coloured up. So that the original art for that is quite nice and large.
The second iteration of Giant Size recently.
That's right. That's right. So that particular one there. So
Again, if you're on YouTube, you will see this. So this is actually a Peter Chapman commission for Jim Shepard.
I believe so. I have seen the original artwork. So I know when I visited his studio, he had either some copies or originals of ones he'd done for fans, and he said that he'd done them at the time because the artwork had been destroyed, sadly. So another example, if you're interested in seeing one, I think was in the actually in Sunbeams to Sunset. So if you have a look in there, you can see one as well.
Is that the collage that's been used as the dedication?
That's right. So I think with that one, it mostly has the older Frew characters, but the one he did for Jim Shepard had the Phantom. So I know that I think Peter did have some communication with Frew, sort of later on, just occasional. And I know particularly after that Ace exhibition, when there was some more interest in those times, I know he did speak to Jim Shepard, and I believe he did that commission. And I know that they did sort of discuss some of the old days, because Jim Shepard did have an interest in the history. He had some connection. He'd known, obviously, Ron Forsyth. Jim Shepard had known him. He'd come in at that sort of transition point where some of those people were still around and working in that period in the 80s. So I know that Peter Chapman did speak. He would talk to Jim Shepard and even just about the older history. that Jim Shepard had a lot of interest in.
I know that Peter wrote to John Ryan in '76 because John was doing panel by panel, and John was asking everyone who was approaching, for copies of original artwork along with comic books and that. And I've actually got a copy of the letter in front of me, in which Peter wrote back saying, "I never ever kept original artwork from comics. When in Sydney, I'll contact Frew. I'm not sure whether he kept the originals or tossed them out." So the follow-up letter from that was, there are no originals. So they're all gone at that point. That's so sad when you think about it, all of this artwork, which just, went into the dumpster. So he had none.
In the fandom world, quite famously, there's very little Ray Moore stuff that's survived. A lot of those early, Ray Moore originals, which people would love to have their hands on, just got destroyed. The value placed on the original artwork, get it printed, and then its job is done.
Really appreciate it. Jeremy, one of the things I do want to ask you as we look to wrap up, what was Peter's reaction when you talked to him about how you were actually doing some Phantom work?
Yes, so when I had started doing some of those ones for Frew, I actually called up Peter and his wife Meg, and they had the same phone number. And very, very kindly after that, they invited me to see that exhibition with them. That was one of the things there was one cover of mine he did quite like. I think it was maybe 1718 was a particular one. I actually sent it to him in the post, and I spoke to him on the phone, and he did like that one. He said it was pretty good. And
nice.
so one thing that I was very happy about was there was an interview he'd done around the time of the Ledger Award and the exhibition and things, sort of that 2015, 2016 period. And he actually mentioned me in one of them. So I felt very good there, where he mentioned that, someone who'd been a student is now working on something that he used to work on. So that was really nice. And also, Peter's wife is very active with the Giant Size. All of the things that are published in there. Glenn Ford, goes through and gets her permission. She gets paid, all those things there. And she's a lovely lady. I sometimes hear from her on Facebook. She's a lovely person. So that the whole Chapman family are really nice people.
That's wonderful.
That's it's great to hear about Glenn like doing it properly as well, which a lot of past comic publishers would not even bother doing. So it's with
Glenn, he works with the Wheelerhand family, the Dixon family, all of the different families of the comic books he reprints. So there's some really interesting rare things that are going to come at some point. Some missing issues of material that have been found. There's some exciting things. I've seen some of them, and I think Giant Size is going to have some good stuff.
I think with Glenn, it comes, a lot of his outlook on doing this comes from being an artist himself for as many years as he was and has been. I'm sure he's got his own stories of woe. I know every encounter I've had with Glenn has just been nothing but positive. It's been great. Last time I saw him was in Sydney, where we sat down after a ledger and proceeded to get everyone drunk. And he made a beeline for me, sat me down, and we just spoke for a good hour and a half, which, I really appreciated. He's a lovely, lovely guy. But I think the way he deals with the states and the way he deals with creators is probably as good as anyone I've ever heard. Everyone gets paid for everything they do. Everyone gets recognition. Everyone gets credit. It's how it should be.
Yeah, I agree.
Creators should be recognized, and they should be compensated properly. And families of creators, instead of being ignored because, that was your dad or that was your mum or your grandparents and who cares, they should be compensated. So Glenn's doing the right thing. He's doing the good thing. And, you know, to be honest, the comic book industry could use more of Glenn and Glenn Ford than what they could pretty much anyone else I can think of.
Very well said. So thank you for that. Now, I guess one of the last questions I want to ask you is, where does Peter's work, in your opinions, Daniel and Jeremy, to the importance of Australia comic history?
I think, well, just one thing, like even just his art school that he did, you know, from the 70s, I think he said that he was inspired after he saw an art class that wasn't going so well in Wee Waa in country New South Wales. And he started helping at the TAFE sort of around there. I think John Ducker, the principal at the TAFE, asked him if he was interested in teaching. And, you know, I think once he wasn't as happy with the curriculum at the TAFE, he started his own school in 1989, and that was touring around big areas of country New South Wales from 1993 until about 2009. So, you know, all of the artists, you know, some of them have been sort of comics illustration, but so many people that, you know, in country New South Wales who he taught and, you know, people he inspired. I think one of the major things that he did was introducing Phil Belbin to Australian comics.
Yes.
Phil Belbin was his friend and has been huge influence. And that's how he got into comics, through Peter Chapman.
I think my take on it would be you can't underestimate the importance of someone like Peter Chapman when you look at Jeremy, for example, that he was a guy who, Peter Chapman that is, that drew so much and did so much. And where a lot of his peers, when the comic book boom finished in the early 60s, just vanished or went on to other things, and just you never heard from them, or they just didn't bother. He kept going and he kept giving back. And the fact that he trained with his art school so many people, and you see the success with Jeremy and other people that he did. Now, Jeremy will pass on those lessons to other people. So Peter Chapman's work ethic, his ability to draw, his ability to create lives on, and it will continue to go on and on and on. And not just on an inspirational level, but on a practical level. Someone comes to Jeremy and says, I'm having problems with this or this layout or whatever. He's going to sit there and go, you should try this, that, and the other. And these are lessons that he learned by going to Peter Chapman, who went, you should try this, that, or the other. And then the next person that comes to that person that Jeremy teaches, and someone comes up to them and says, I'm having problems. And they go, oh, try this. And what they won't realize is they're applying lessons that Peter Chapman learned way back when. And that's the whole thing, is to carry it on, to keep on giving. So his influence is his legacy. We're still talking about him. We're still talking about his work. And we're talking about work that was done before any of us were around on the planet. I mean, this was work that our grandparents bought, to be quite honest. And that's the thing. We still talk about him. A lot of his peers we don't talk about. Peter Chapman we do, and we still will. So that, to me, is the influence and legacy lives on. And that's the best thing that anybody can ever hope for, is that they're not forgotten, and that what they did had an impact, and he's still having an impact to this day.
Yes, he's still printed, you know, to this day in giant size. And, you know, a lot of people may not even realize, but he did go back to painting covers. You know, I think 1987 to the 90s, he was doing covers for Horwitz on their reissues of Larry and Stretch, J.E. MacDonald novels. So, you know, he had a long career from the 40s until the 2000s. It's one of the longest careers ever, and he was the most prolific artist. I think really he's had a huge impact just
And
in all those areas.
His career continues on, Jeremy, through you and through others. And that's, you know, that's something which we all would love to aspire to, that, you know, our legacies and our careers will live on through people that we've never met and never known, and people we have met and known, and they'll continue on until long after we go on. And his will, his is. Every Phantom cover you do, Jeremy, is, in a way, Peter Chapman's got a little bit of ink on there, just a little smidgen, and that's all it needs.
Very well said.
Sorry, one question that's going to bug me. If I don't ask this, I'll regret it. But right at the very start, Jeremy, I mentioned, and part of the biography was that Peter Chapman had suffered from poliomyelitis and was affected by polio. I've got an uncle-in-law who would be one of the last people I would have thought in Australia to get polio before the vaccine came in, and his leg is buggered to this day, to be honest. What effect did polio have on Peter, and was that a long-lasting effect? He took that through to the grave, so to speak?
So, well, one of the effects was that it gave him a lot of time to draw.
Yeah.
I think that was something he'd always say. It gave him a lot of practice in drawing with both hands, so he could do that quite well. And I think, sort of he got to a very good standard at an early age. And I think it was like his artwork, his mum showed it to a salesman. The salesman recommended him go to the TAFE, and that's how everything sort of started. But it did have an impact on him, and I know later in life it did have a bit of an impact with him too. So yeah, it did have an impact through his life, sort of getting him into drawing, but sort of later on as well in his life.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I just that's been bugging me ever since I read it out right at the start.
So. And I know you mentioned as well about the John Sands. So with the John Sands, I know that there was an exhibition of a lot of that. There was a book as well, the Macquarie University, that if anyone wants to can seek that out. But I don't think he did the Phantom greeting cards, but he did do a lot of other greeting cards for John Sands. He did a lot of wrapping papers, a lot of things. Like he was so quick, he did an entire encyclopedia set. So he did the color illustrations for that. He did do a lot of material there for the John Sands Company.
Oh, wow.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Daniel and Jeremy, for joining us. If there is anyone that wants to find out more about us, our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can email us at chroniclechamber@gmail.com. You can send us your thoughts, your feedback, and your opinions via that, or via our social media platforms, or over at the YouTube channel. Now, you can subscribe to us via YouTube or through your favourite podcast apps, including iTunes or Spotify. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed learning about Peter. And from myself, happy phantoming.
Happy phantoming, everybody.
You guys can say happy phantoming as well.
Happy phantom.
Happy phantoming.
Phantom's always there, but you won't mind the phantom.